The Japanese military regarded the powerful United States fleet at Pearl Harbor as a dagger pointed at Japan's throat. On Sunday, the 7th of December 1941, Japan moved to destroy that dagger. At the time of Pearl Harbor, Australia had already mobilised and was locked in battle with the Axis powers in the Middle East and in Europe. The Prime Minister of the day, John Curtin, announced to the nation,
"My Lord Mayor, men and women of Australia, for I'm speaking now to everybody in this Commonwealth, wherever he or she may be. The full Cabinet today directed the War Cabinet to gazette the necessary regulations for the complete mobilisation and the complete ordering of all the resources, human and material, in this Commonwealth for the defence of this Commonwealth." That means clearly and specifically that every human being in this country is now, whether he or she likes it, at the service of the government to work in the defence of Australia.
As Japan expanded aggressively into the Pacific and Indochina, the serious gaps in the defence of the Malay Peninsula became increasingly obvious. A militia battalion, the 49th from Queensland, had earlier been dispatched to Port Moresby. Its training was far from complete before it left, and on arrival it was put to work on the wharves and a variety of public works, further training ignored. With war on our doorstep, now a reality, the garrison at Port Moresby was increased to brigade strength in January 1942 with the arrival of the 53rd Battalion from New South Wales and the 39th Battalion from Victoria. For the 39th, it was the beginning of a date with destiny. Raised in September 1941 under Lieutenant Colonel Owen, the 39th, like the 53rd, embarked with only basic training complete. Both battalions joined the 49th in doing everything but training for war. Bill Guest was a sergeant with A Company, 39 Battalion.
But when we got off the Aquitania, nobody knew we were coming, which was sort of went along with things that happened in those days. And we marched 7 miles out to Jackson's airstrip, which was nothing what it is now. It was only consisted of about a mile of runway and towards the coast, and going up the other way was secondary growth, full of wallabies and birds and mosquitoes, and set up on the top. And so when we settled down, we discovered that there's nobody there to do any digging and other sort of work except ourselves. So we just had to go along and unload the ships and dig the various defensive positions around Port Moresby. And the Japanese came over from Rebelle, and they gave us a bit of hurry up. I think we had about over 100 raids, air raids between early February and June. And so we did very, very little training. Actually, the 39th, I can't recall that was ever on an exercise. It was nearly always on defensive positions.
Across a couple that was in the Boer War. So you can imagine how antique the weapons were that we went away with. We never got Tommy guns until somewhere in about the April of 1942. And when we went over the Owen Stanleys, we went with the Louis guns and the rifle, the 303 rifle.
The chaos brought about by the bombing of Port Moresby on the 3rd and 5th of February, the first of many, showed how vulnerable the garrison was to large-scale invasion. Rabaul in New Britain had fallen to a massive Japanese onslaught only a week before, all those taken prisoner massacred. The Japanese, in their headlong rush down the Malay Peninsula, had swept all opposition aside, and it's uncertain why they did not continue on after Rabaul and use their momentum to roll up the Allied defenders in Port Moresby. What may have been a tactical error thus gave the garrison some breathing space. A further reprieve came with the Battle of the Coral Sea and later Midway, but still training was ignored.
Well, the training was pretty poor. I went back into the regular army after the war, and I've had a fair bit to do with training. And when I look back on it now, it was pathetic. We arrived, we went away on Boxing Day in 1941, and I don't know what time, it was early January, I forget now, when we arrived in Port Moresby, and the training was zilch. We were more or less unloading boats and used for duties around there, you know. And purely as companies, we weren't as a battalion. We didn't know anybody else in the battalion. We only knew that your own people in that company, and that went on for a long time, right up until we went on to the trail. Then we started to meet some of the rest of the battalion, and later on in the war, after we were over at the Battle of the Beaches, you know, going rebuild, well, we sort of knew other companies then.
A new brigade commander, Brigadier Porter, was able to secure an influx of experienced AIF officers returned from the Middle East. Thus began the belated job of not only training, but lifting the by now low morale of the brigade. Military authorities in Australia reasoned that Coral Sea and Midway may have only delayed Japanese intentions to take Port Moresby. An attempt could yet be made to land in strength and force an overland passage to Kokoda and thence to Port Moresby. It was decided that a rifle company should be tasked to conduct a reconnaissance of the Kokoda Trail. The brigade commander chose B Company, the 39th Battalion.
Well, I'd like to tell you a little thing before we went over. Our morale got very, very low because the night before we left, we were listening to a little wireless set that one of the boys had there, the SIGs had, and Tobruk had fallen the night before we left, and the morale was a little low. As regards to the terrain, some of the mountains over there were, we do know that some were 8,000 to 9,000 feet high that we had to go across, and every night and every afternoon it rained, so therefore it was slippery, very, very slippery, and it's very, very hard to get up the mountains. And when we started off, we were carrying our packs and our foods and our ammunition and our weapons. Right. So you can imagine what a weight we were carrying.
All we had was a pair of shorts and a shirt. We never had a replacement. Actually, we had a haversack, which was on the back. That consisted of no replacement clothing, but half a towel, half thing personal. We had Bren guns were in the future to us. We had the old Lewis guns, which had seen service during the First World War, 303 rifles, grenades, 36M grenades, and bayonets, that was it. No heavy machine guns or anything like that. The submachine gun was the Thompson submachine gun, the Tommy gun, because up to then the Owens hadn't appeared to us.
On the 26th of June 1942, B Company, Officer Commanding Captain Sam Templeton, set off with his company of only partially trained soldiers, supported by a detachment of the Pacific Islands Battalion. A body of young soldiers, average age 18.5 years, who would shortly come face to face with the best trained and equipped jungle fighters in the world.
And they called us up about 4 o'clock in the afternoon to issue rations to us. and we said, what are we going to put them in? And they said, oh, get your mosquito nets, tear the bottom off the mosquito nets and wrap it up in that. And we wrapped our tea up in one portion, the sugar in another, salt in another. And of course, no time they're sopping wet. We stuffed them in our packs. And off we went, never knowing what it was going to be like. Didn't have a clue. Nobody told us anything.
You know, that preparation beforehand, people forget the lack of preparation had a terrific amount to do with the trouble, a lot of the troubles and tribulations we suffered from later on.
Yeah.
For example, wearing steel helmets, particularly those old style dish soup plate bloody steel helmets. Steel helmets in the jungle were a no-no, and they didn't know that even until later on. And we always wore slouch hats, and later on they wore bush hats and things.
But remember they sent us some...
And we had khaki clothes, remember?
No, yeah,
and
khaki.
they got green bloody dye,
Yeah.
and we dyed our clothes, and as soon as you got wet, all the dye ran out.
But they were Lake Biola, wasn't
You
it?
had heliotrope sort of clothes, plus a big string of pimples all over your legs into the bargain, where the dye affected your skin in some
Yes,
cases.
that's right.
I mean, that
That was
when
at
you see
Biola
people
we got
today
that.
walking around these beautiful camouflage suits and everything, you'd have given your life.
Yeah.
Well, probably some poor sons did, for lack of that, but you'd have given anything to get something like that. And the lack of...
Well, we had no nets to put over our tin helmets. I got
Yeah.
a Japanese net
never
off
even
his
had
helmet.
scrim nets to put over your helmet to camouflage it.
Put the leaves
And every
in.
time you bent over it, it'd go bonk on the ground, fall off, or scrape on twig. Oh, awful. And these were minor things, you know, actually minor things.
Big irritations.
Added up to the lot. And then off you go into the complete unknown and tackle that. We thought going up to Uberry was fairly tough. But by God, that second day going up that golden staircase up the Irabiwa Ridge was just something out of this world.
Had to fight every part of the campaign at close quarters. The visibility was only a few feet. One of the first lessons we learnt when we got up there, if you got behind a tree for protection, you'd probably find that you were in front of it, because the enemy were all around you, and that's how close the encounters were. So it meant that with our weaponry, we had to rely primarily on close fighting weapons, such as I indicated, Tommy guns and hand grenades. But the Japanese were quite effective with the use at times of their longer range weapons. They had what you call a mountain gun and medium machine guns, which outranged any of our weapons. And if they could get a crack at us across a valley, for instance, they could do that with impunity and with devastating effect. So that was one of the ways, apart from outnumbering us, that caused us to be forced back. And one of the most difficult operations to conduct in warfare is a fighting withdrawal, because it's a delicate decision you've got to make. You've got to hold a position as long as you can, inflict as many casualties as you can, and then particularly as it occurred in the Owen Stanleys, where the enemy could unseen and unheard move right around you and get behind you, you then had the delicate decision to make as to how much longer you could hold in that position without trying to extricate your force. And Brigadier Potts did that in masterly fashion and in a very effective way to make that decision to pull you out at the right time, otherwise you'd be annihilated.
That's We estimated, for what it was worth, that each of us had lost about 2 stone in weight. We had no means of weighing ourselves, but we were all thin, emaciated virtually, and quite candidly, it's difficult to say how much longer we could have kept going, because it seemed to be so endless, this dragging through this jungle, sometimes on little native pads which seemed to start from nowhere and petered out into nowhere, and raining every night, never a flat piece of ground to sleep on. More often than not, it was a matter of bracing your feet against a tree, some nights, because we'd go until it was dark. So you never had opportunity in those last few minutes before the darkness came in so suddenly. A few nights I can remember putting my bayonet into the ground and putting my feet against them, because that's how it was. It was either uphill or downhill. There was no level patch of ground, and so that you just had to make yourself secure so you wouldn't roll down a hill during the course of the night.
Native carriers, commanded by Captain Kensel, a rubber planter before the war, gave invaluable assistance to the Australians. But the young soldiers still had to struggle with 30-kilo packs of equipment through rain-drenched jungle.
They had native carriers to carry the gear, but of course the troops they weren't really conditioned, although they'd been digging a lot around Port Moresby. And they took it pretty easily. It took about 6 days to get across from out of Rest Day. But when we got to a place called Ura Creek, which was only about 3 days off or 2 days walk from Denaki, which overlooked the Kokoda Plateau, it was then that the Bren guns caught up, and the night before we took off from there, the Bren Lewis gunners were called in to hand in their Lewis guns, and they issued a Bren gun still in their grease, and that's the way they carried them into action. Still the grease up the barrel. Huh? And the rations, of course, were getting scarcer, the food getting scarcer as you went across there because of the paucity of carriers. They have a very big carrier problem. There's no aircraft around to do any drops in any case. There's nowhere to drop it because the Japanese owned Kokoda at that stage. They were in occupation of it.
But eventually when you came to the top, you then had to go down, and you went down, 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 and the weight on your back and the motion of your legs, you just couldn't stop them. You just ran, and the thing was you couldn't pull yourself up at all. You just went on and on and on till you hit the bottom or stood over on your tail.
And we fought for a couple of hours there, and we were really surrounded. We in trouble. We had no hope of getting out. And you might remember I told you about Sinopa, the police boy. He found a way to get us out, and we were fortunate enough that the 80 troops that were there were able to get away without any casualties.
Right.
You must remember though that every time we were surrounded, we had to try and get out. We couldn't stop and fight as much as what we would have liked to, because we were the only people that was between, let us say, the Japs and Moresby. There was 132 of us, so there wasn't a great deal that we could do. If we get wiped out, there's nobody to stop them.
The first exchange of fire on the Kokoda Trail took place at 2:30 p.m. on the 24th of July. The advance elements of the Japanese bumped B Company's 11 platoon. For the Australians, it then became a series of withdrawals into a defensive position, then withdrawal again. B Company was quickly reinforced with the remainder of 39 Battalion, but against impossible numbers, Kokoda fell to the Japanese on the 29th of July. The commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Owen, was killed in the battle. Command passed to the 2IC Major Cameron, who launched his A Company into a counter-attack.
And he decided to attack Kokoda, try and take it back. And he used 3 companies when he hit the 3. He gave A Company the task of going into Kokoda and taking it, and C and D Company were to go on various routes to clear the way and also come in to reinforce us after we'd taken the village. But unfortunately, for some reason, the Japanese evacuated Kokoda before it happened, and A Company arrived unchallenged, not knowing that C and D Company had both been ambushed on the way in and had gone back up to Denaki.
And so we were sent up more or less in a hurry, and actually it turned out to be quite a forced march, because the fighting that occurred at Ishirawa was particularly savage. On both sides there were considerable casualties, and although our force didn't appear to be overwhelmed there, it was suffering such severe casualties that it looked doubtful whether it could succeed in holding the Japanese, because by that time the Japanese had considerably increased their attacking force. They'd started off with a composite battalion attacking the 39th, and eventually that battalion of the Japanese captured Kokoda and then moved up to the top of the range, pushing the 39th battalion back, so that the 39th was in a desperate plight when the first elements of the 14th and 16th brigades battalions arrived at Ishirawa.
Kokoda was successfully retaken from the Japanese, but bad weather prevented the urgently needed air resupply. The Japanese fiercely counterattacked, and ammunition on the point of exhaustion, the Australians were forced to withdraw. The day after A Company withdrew, an RAAF airdrop was successfully made over Kokoda, to the surprise and delight of the Japanese, who now held the feature. The 16th of August, 6 days after the loss of Kokoda, Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Honour took command of the 39 Battalion. A veteran of the 6th Division, he'd seen service in the Middle East and would quickly establish a relationship with his men which would endure to this day. A crucial factor which worked against the Australians in the early days of the campaign was that of resupply. Poor staff work resulted in chaos at supply depots. Airdrops often went astray, or were gathered in by the Japanese, or were damaged when they did reach the troops.
You remember all those strange things that happened? 40,000 rations.
Yeah.
It was all in plane loads of them. They left Moresby, they disappeared. They were
Like
miles
Mala.
waiting us to get there.
Yeah.
When we got there was nothing. There was no, and nobody ever found out what happened to those rations, whether it was an administrative bungle, and Potts went mad, everybody went mad, but nothing ever happened. And we still had no rations, and they said, you will stay here till you get them. And then the word filtered back down the track. The 14th are committed, they're in trouble, you've got to get going, get straight up there and get in with them. And the blokes were anxious to go, but we still had no rations.
Most of the supplies that we've landed on target were all broken up, so that our rations would be a handful of crushed biscuits, broken biscuits, and badly dented. We had to look at our bully beef and other rations to see they weren't punching.
Sometimes they were dropped in the wrong place and the Japs got the biscuits or the bully beef or whatever it was that we were getting dropped, or the ammunition, and we couldn't get down to get it in a lot of cases. So it was the native carriers, the Fuzzy Wuzzy, that really was the main source of our supply.
That morning the biscuit bombers came over. In the early stage, all they could do as far as supplying the troops on the trail was to send over these DC-3s, these Dakotas, and without any sort of parachutes or any sort of protection, just throw out anything that they had, tins of bully beef and tins of biscuits and what have you, and just push them out with their feet or by hand, and with the hope that a certain amount of them would land in a fairly restricted area. Well, the first sight was to see these tins of bully beef coming down like golden rain, because bully beef tins were yellow in colour, or a golden colour, and so this appeared quite amusing until some of the bully beef tins were coming through the huts. A couple of our chaps got hit by them, because even if a bully beef tin landed on the ground, it could still, because of coming down from some hundreds of feet, rebound and hit you on the shins or anywhere. Two of our chaps were quite seriously hurt, and one chap was killed. This is an indication of the danger of it.
Weather conditions did nothing to ease the situation. The medical treatment and evacuation of casualties also posed great difficulties. Nonetheless, dedicated young doctors worked tirelessly to care for the wounded in almost impossible conditions.
We went back into the major battle at Kokoda, and I got wounded there, and spent something like 18 months in hospital and trying to save my leg, which they didn't achieve. But in those days there was no antibiotics or anything at all, and of course with conditions there it didn't take much to get an infection because you couldn't get proper dressing if you weren't till you can get back to base hospital, which took some days to get there. So you're very subject to infection and that sort of thing.
The Japs' method of attack was they would come up the main track, find out what the resistance was, where it was, and they would outflank. They would go on either the right flank or the left flank, and they'd be up above us like that. As soon as that happened, we had to pull back. And we did that more or less for the balance of the campaign.
Well, in the jungle, they certainly were masters of the jungle. They could move in that jungle and I couldn't find them. And I think that you had to get to within about 10 feet before you could see them. They really mastered the jungle warfare.
Supremely confident in their greater numbers and superior weaponry, the Japanese, on one night, used lanterns in full view of the Australians to move into a forming up position ready for battle the next day.
Our battalion, having done this forced march, had virtually barely got their breath back when they were told to dig in because the Japs were coming down the opposite side of the valley and they could possibly launch an attack even that day. But the attack didn't eventuate that day. The two forward companies of the 2nd 27th Battalion, the A and B companies, cleared fields of fire on the what we call Mission Ridge through the Kunai grass and dug themselves in as best they could with steel helmets and bayonets and empty bully beef tins. That's all they had to use to dig in. And then we had the awesome sight that night of seeing the Japanese. I've never heard or seen anything like it in my life. They came down the opposite side of the valley all night long like a long glowworm using lanterns to make their way because it's hard enough even moving along that track in daylight without doing it at night. And we had no weapons that we could use with a sufficient range to even impede their advance. So that next day they mounted their attack, and it was particularly savage onslaught, mostly against our two forward companies, and they withstood the attacks all day long. And they were still there holding their positions, and by that night we had the job of trying to get water and food and more grenades up to them, and at the same time some of the troops in the rear companies went forward and recovered the dead and the wounded from our forward companies, and that was the situation that night. Next day, of course, the Japs continued their attack.
However, as the tide of battle eventually turned against the Japanese, and with supply lines overrun, rumours of cannibalism diminished respect.
Our company was moving through another company. The company had already taken its position. We were going to move through them to take up, go along the track, take a forward position. And there was a dead Japanese on the track, and one of our officers was searching through his haversack. And one of our blokes said, "Did you get any souvenirs, Corley?" And he said, "No." He said, "Only got a few pounds of OR steak." And he held up these strips of human flesh that had been cut into strips.
We did run into the atrocity. We ran into that, but I was about a day away at that time, and that did create a lot of bad feeling amongst our fellows against the Japs. There's no doubt about that. I think from then on, I don't think there were many Japanese prisoners taken.
The battle for the Kokoda Trail was not to end until Gona fell on the 7th of December 1942, then Buna on the 2nd of January 1943, and finally Sanananda on the 21st of January 1943. What was for the Japanese the campaign to take Port Moresby from the Kokoda Trail ended 6 months after their landing.
We had pretty heavy casualties, of course, but a lot of it was just sickness. Just to keep you in the firing line, that was filled up with quinine and suppressant drugs. But eventually, no matter how much of that you took, you still went down. And it was just a terrible time.
My son was in the ballot for Vietnam. I was not sorry he didn't get pulled out. Not sorry at all.
Yeah.
It's futile. It's futile. When you see your young friends, my mate Swinger Graham getting blown up with a mountain gun, 17 years old. So it's silly, isn't it? Silly.
There's no point, and I look at it now, it's money and politics that the fellas on top say, well, we've got a problem, you fellas join up and go to war. We don't like their politics, we don't like their religion, we don't like the way they're treating us. And they sit in their big comfortable chairs and say, well, supply us with boats and ammunition and 5 bob a day and away you go. I guess I'd do the same again. My mates joined up, so I thought, well, that's good enough for them, I'll be in it too.
Well, I think war, if it's necessary, should be every young person's role to protect his country. Not to go overseas protecting other people's country, and not to go interfering with other people's politics, ways of living, because we are a very young country still. And when I see in the in the news and everything else that the young Australians should go over and interfere, and the Australian politicians too, interfere with overseas politics, to me that is wrong. Let's look after our own country, our own people, until we are as old at least as some of the older countries. But I don't like war.
The 39th was a militia unit, an Army Reserve unit in today's terms. And whilst other militia units fought on the trail, the 39th was the first militia unit to confront and fight the Japanese, and it fought alone for a month against overwhelming numbers. 50 years on, they still wear with pride the name given to them by the AIF soldiers. Exhausted, their uniforms in tatters, as they withdrew through the AIF lines, someone was heard to call them those ragged, bloody heroes.
With the 2nd 27th Battalion, in the course of those 2 days, went in there with 500 men, and they lost 43 killed and 46 wounded at Mission Ridge and Brigade Hill. And as I said, 3 of those wounded died on the way back, which is a very high proportion of casualties to incur over such a short period. The only other battalion that really, well, the other 2 battalions of the brigade were involved much longer than the 2nd 27th, but the 2nd 14th Battalion lost every other man in the battalion either killed or wounded. In other words, 50% casualties, and this was over a period of, well, from the 3rd week in August to the middle of September, call it 3 weeks. So it was a much more continuous period, but they were involved in this rearguard action over that, or we call it a fighting withdrawal, over that period.
I don't think much of it at all, and it's a shocking thing. When you think of, as I said, I stayed on and went into the regular army. I went back into the army to go to Korea, but I didn't get there while the war was on. And I soldiered right up and finished in Vietnam. But as 19, I had just turned 19 when I had the first shot, and these things are as vivid today as they are with the old original Anzacs, who were only young men then. You never forget. It is imprinted forever on your memory. Dates may become blurred, names become blurred, but the memories never.